I want everybody to make sure that they have this up and running and can see it. So open it up in a new tab so that you have it. This is a follow at home type thing today. You're allowed to consult it just like you would be allowed to consult the jar if you were working in an event. And I want you to have it at your fingertips. So make sure you've got that up and running. But let's jump into a quick survey. I want to figure out who I'm talking to today. While I recognize a few usernames, I think it's a good idea to find out where we are in your journey as a judge. So when it comes to actually running irregular REL events, what is your level of experience? Is it 0? Are you a novice? Are you an expert? Are you a master? And while you're answering, just remember the scale's a little loose. Just go with your gut. New and new. Wow. Glad to see that you're here. Brand new rules advisor. Awesome. And another one. We've got lots of experience, new from January. A few big events. Okay. I know when Isaac and Toby answer, we'll get a little bit of sage wisdom in the answers, but this really is for everybody because the jar is for everybody. So we're going to have some fun here. So there are some different perspectives, and I want to talk about the shift in perspectives since I started playing about 8 years ago. Players today are more savvy and at times more unaware than I think ever before. If I were to pick one reason for that, it would be because the game has continued to diversify. I bet most judges here today can list more formats than fingers on their hands. 10 or so years ago, that wasn't the case. We didn't have historic, we didn't have pioneer, tiny leaders, and more. Formats like Pauper were not broadly played. Maybe one store in 10 or 15 or 20 you could find something Pauper related. Diversity in play options leads to specializations among players. So the more play options we have, the less of a understanding or general understanding of overall Magic sometimes because people get really focused, especially those EDH players, right? For instance, players will need to focus on the meta of their favorite format or formats. And they're more concerned with their matchups and optimal sideboards, right? This concept's critical because when we judge at regular, it is very important to remember that the baseline is not the same for everyone. At a competitive modern event with 500 players, the players and judges are more often on closer to equal terms in relation to understanding of the game. If you take a call at a table, you'll find that the player there often knows more about their cards than you do, or sometimes it's the case anyway. But at regular, you'll find that the disparity is often much more pronounced. You'll have brand new players and grizzled veterans in the same draft pot. You'll have players that have played a deck once, or even have read a deck tech if you're lucky, on the standard brew that they're piloting facing off against someone with 200 reps in with their deck and in the meta. Regular's kind of the wild west of playing Magic. And that's okay. This slide helps to visually show the different perspectives that do exist. All of them occur for the first time at regular. The level before that is basically kitchen table Magic, where players don't interact with a Magic judge in any formal way. There's also differences between your friendly local game stores, and anybody that's judged or has played at more than one store will really understand this. Some stores lean towards larger, more competitive events as their bread and butter. They tend to draw spikier players. Others will only run a couple of drafts on Friday night Magic and are lucky to have a 10-person competitive event every month. That's weird. These different settings lead to different player expectations, so it's important that the supporting document for those running these events be flexible and understanding of these differences. Player expectations may vary, but we still need to offer a consistent, friendly environment for them to play in. So before we get too far into philosophy, let's talk about where we come from here. The Judging at Regular document, or JAR, as we affectionately refer to it, was first recreated in June of 2010 by James Mackey. Back then it was called the Regular REL Guide to Fixing Errors, and that version was only 2 pages long. Then Kim Warren, now retired, was in charge of the rewrite that brought us the 2014 edition, and that version was only 2 pages long. And if you've read the 2019 version, you've seen the last major rewrite, and that version is only 2 pages long. Due to the nature of the very open-ended 2-page document, the Judging at Regular document doesn't undergo constant change like the IPG and other parts of the MTR. The JAR is designed to be accessible, friendly, and most of all sturdy. A document like this should not undergo constant revision. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that the JAR shouldn't undergo constant revision? And I'll give you a moment to ponder that and maybe throw an answer or two up there. It might, Isaac, eventually, but they are trying to keep it to 2. I like that answer, Jamie. That's part of the reason, I'm sure. Yeah, keep it simple. Ultimately, why it is it's because it's a guiding document for stores. The JAR is not just for judges; it's for store employees, and we want to make sure that store employees don't have to reread a new document every 3 to 6 months if we can avoid that. If you rewrite the JAR every 3 to 6 months, you have to expect that the new version of the JAR has to permeate not only to judges, but also to all the different store employees that have to read this. And keeping it to 2 pages is neat because then it fits on a single piece of paper, which is why we emphasize the 2 pages bit. I think future editions will probably also be 2 pages when they write them. It's a definite goal that in an underlying philosophy with just how the document is written. So when do we JAR exactly? And the number one reason is prize support. And prize support could be its whole presentation on its own, but not really for judges, maybe for TOs. Classically speaking, most events that are regular REL, even at a Magic Fest on a given weekend, there's one main event, and there's hundreds of side events. And thousands more regular events are run at friendly local game stores. Prize support is essentially up to the TO. If prize support is going to be particularly rich, let's say a volcanic island, then talking to the TO about prize support will be a good idea. Why? Well, because pricing, if it's too rich, brings out players that exhibit behaviors contrary to the goals of regular, that being a fun and educational environment. It also brings out players that have expectations of a higher level of judge support and competitive rules enforcement level. So prize support is the main indicator that an event should be run at regular or competitive. But you also have 2 other indicators here. One is if the event is particularly large. Size is an indicator, but it's not always definitive. It's not uncommon to have a 400-player, 4-turn modern event at a GP, or it wasn't anyway. I guess one day we'll be there again. Prize support was still flat in those situations, and players were more playing for points to spend on the prize wall and to have a good time than anything else. Another indicator is that we won events without deck lists. if you need to collect deck lists, you're probably talking about a competitive event. I mean, consider this. Is it a good idea to be doing deck checks during each turn at a pre-release? Probably not. I know some pre-releases that are hyper-competitive, but doing deck checks at a pre-release is kind of a nightmare. Does anybody know why it's a nightmare? I'll give you a hint. It's a two-word answer. I like that one, and that's part of the reason. The real answer is two words called continuous build. Pre-release events are sealed events, so all limited regular events are run under the guidelines of continuous build, which means that the deck that they registered for match one, game one, may not be the same deck that they're playing 3 turns later or the next match or even at the end of the night. So continuous build is huge. And it goes beyond that. It's confusing to new players. It's time consuming. There oftentimes, and I'm not saying that it's a good idea, but oftentimes a pre-release could have 100 players and one judge working the event. Is it a good idea for you to be tied up for 10 or 15 minutes doing deck checks when you should be out on the floor? I don't think so. So the whole idea of deck checks is an indicator that if you need them, you probably should be playing it. You probably should be running the event at competitive. So let's have another question. And this is really important, and this is getting to the meat and potatoes of this presentation. In a sentence or less, what's the philosophy of regular REL? And Isaac, you're not allowed to answer this. Sure. Has anybody ever heard the philosophy of hugs or DQs? Waiting for Jamie. Right. So you'll hear this expression probably the first time you work at GP, but you're going to hear it now. And it's because it's one that's been around in the program for a very long time. And it's that regular REL's philosophy in general is hugs or DQs. And while I make a slight objection because it implies hugging as an action that can be construed to be performed by judges, when we really shouldn't do actions like that unless both parties agree, I think that most of us understand what it is talking about is the figurative use of the word. The idea is simple. In almost all cases, the fix is to be kind, explain, and help fix the game, right? Just as Kevin's saying, you want the players to come back. You want to make it enjoyable. Penalties in regular come but very rarely. We don't use words like caution or warning when we're talking to players at regular. Cautions and warnings do not exist. Okay? Not in the sense that have any meaningful any meaning to players at this level. We can use a game loss for repeated behaviors. A match loss is issued only for a forfeit due to not showing up for a match after 10 minutes. And then we move to the solution for serious problems, which is where the DQ comes into play. I want to share something here just to put it all in the context. And Isaac, you're right. Cautions don't exist at comp, although, people use that word when they talk about slow play, but we're not going to get into that whole debacle. But I want to share something here that puts everything into context. In my time as a judge, I've largely been involved with regular events, most often run at local stores. I have DQ'd players 2 whole times. 5 years, 2 DQs. I've spoken with other judges who have never done 1, and a few in that time span that have done more. DQs aren't common, okay? We talk about them a lot because it's very important to get them right, but they don't happen often. Your average player and even your not-so-average player is there to play Magic, not lose their entry fee and end up in a situation where they can't play Magic for 6 months or more. As much as we talk about it, actual cheating is rare. So with that said, and I'm going to let Isaac weigh in on this one because but I want to wait for a moment and see what people say first. Does anyone know what trend has happened with penalties in comp REL over the last 5 years? Okay. Fair. Isaac, do you know? Exactly. Thank you. Over the last 5 years, documents like the IPG have become friendlier to players. We've moved away from using game losses as a penalty almost entirely and have moved way more into the let's give a warning and explanation and try and educate players. And this is happening at comp. That same philosophy has found its way into the jar. And I think that's really fascinating. We're going to talk about it when we get to that point. But I just wanted to throw that out there because we're talking about the hugs versus DQs. So let's get serious about fun for a minute. Just a few moments ago, we were talking about the idea of hugs or DQs. The first sentence in the jar on the slide in front of us is setting that concept up for us. We see players' motivations laid out. Sure, players will tell you that they want to win prizes, or they want to test out a janky brew, or they want to beat that other player finally. I mean, I've got this guy at my local game store I've never beaten. He drives me crazy about it. But what most of us are really saying is that we want to have fun. They want to socialize. Players, when they go to Friday Night Magic or find their ways into side events, largely just want to have a good time. If we were to use a sports analogy, competitive is varsity, regular is intramural. So let's talk about it. The initial 5 paragraphs are a guideline to help us navigate regular REL. Within the document itself, these paragraphs are considered the actual philosophy of the jar. I'm going to approach the document holistically in terms of philosophy, but it behooves us to note that these 5 paragraphs are the most important part of the document, since the fixes outlined later don't cover all the situations that may occur. The very first paragraph tells us how we should behave. That's no small thing. Quote, players and judges are encouraged to help one another at appropriate times, end quote. Running a pre-release and all caught up on setup, you can and should spend time socializing with players. Ask them if they got any sick pulls. Spend a few minutes with someone new to Magic or even organized play to give them some help building their decks. Remember that at this stage, you're not to offer unsolicited help, but if you see someone struggling, ask them a few questions and lend assistance if they ask for it. The second paragraph expands on this idea, but for the first time we mention a negative. It's discussed from the point of view of a player who is impacting others with negative behaviors, which, let's face it, at regular is really what happens more often than not. It's framed in a very important light. While it doesn't outright say it this way, the intent here is to emphasize the importance of creating a safe and welcoming space for all gamers. We've heard of stores instituting various codes of conduct, but those are store policies. Here, judges are given a tool of a game loss to deal with what are going to be explained later as repeated, general, unwanted behaviors. It also mentions in this part of the document, serious problems for the very first time. You get a drink of water here. The next paragraph generally outlines how to fix problems that occur during games. It's not overwhelmingly specific because it doesn't want to force you into thinking one solution fits all problems, at least at this point. And also because there are so many different ways players can break Magic. And if you've judged regular, you've seen that. It emphasizes getting players to call a judge to help them with problems. Don't forget to remind players that you're there to help. It instructs you as a judge to emphasize education and keeping the game going over the impact on the game. That's not to say that you shouldn't fix broken game states to the best of your ability, but rather to keep the game going and not fall back into terribly complicated fixes. It mentions, in particular, triggers. And why do you think it takes the time to actually mention triggers? We'll take a moment on that. Ding, right there. That's it. Missed triggers are the most common issues that players will mess up when they first start playing, even experienced players. And we'll talk a little bit more about them in a few minutes. The fourth paragraph gives us guidance about how to close out a call. Important reminders such as double check the rules and give time extensions are here. That is for good reason. Even experienced judges will forget to do both of those tasks. Explaining how trample works, that's one thing. But remembering how layers works is something else. And remember, layers were updated not that long ago as well. Even on the floor of GPs, judges can mess up time extensions. This document is designed to help you represent your store or TO in a professional manner. Given an appropriate time extension may seem like something that isn't a big deal, but it really is to players. The fourth paragraph also gives you a very important tool that we're going to talk about in a completely separate slide in a moment. We'll do a deeper dive on that, but first let's close it out with what the fifth paragraph has for us. The final paragraph of the document is an advisory that certain events will run better at competitive REL. There's no requirement that you do so. I'm contractually obligated to say that. But I can also say that you, as a judge, can elect not to work certain events if you so choose. I can say that I personally won't work a pre-release that requires deck lists, for instance. I also won't cast judgment on someone who chooses to. I'd like to suggest that it's not a great idea, though, for a few reasons. Reasons like pre-releases often draw in new, inexperienced players, and they don't need the added pressure of filling out a deck list, something that they've probably never seen before. Or perhaps something like if you run an event at regular where the prize support is a tropical island, you'll get players who won't understand why you want to just shuffle away that card and not issue a warning. Regular REL is the average Joe of rules enforcement. It's the shirt untucked, McDonald's bag on the table, people laughing and talking about their jank draft format. Please keep that in mind as you go forward. That's a while ago. So is it Inari? Inari brings up a very funny point of Magic history. Years and years ago, now this is before I started playing, so more than 8 years ago, stores did not do releases. They were done as these large regional events. They would draw in 200, 300 players, maybe even more. I've never even seen one myself. And they were these great big party atmospheres and something really unique and wonderful. And then they went and they changed it and they gave pre-releases to stores. They did so to help stores develop better player bases and connect more. And I think overall it's worked out very well. But there's also the whole thing where there are people that do miss the large party event. And I would like to see one personally. I would love to go back in time and attend one because they sounded great. So you're seeing now that I need a catchier title because, I don't know, I just ran out of clever ideas to call my pages. But paragraph 4, we want to talk about that a little bit more because it's a few things. It's a chance for us to outline fixes. It states very specifically that the fixes found in our sister document, the Infraction Procedure Guide, are designed for competitive and do not apply here. It reminds us, and we're going to hit on this again, to give players extra time. And not all events that run at regular are going to have slips. So if no slips are used, just make a note, on your square pad that you're writing down your life totals because you're being a good judge and player. Just write down that table 8 has a 5-minute extension. You should not use fixes from the IPG. The JAR also asks us to use the guidelines that follow for fixes. And if not, use common sense. And common sense is capitalized in my notes. It also says that if the suggested remedy is not suitable in your particular situation, you may suggest an alternative that can be applied if both players agree to it. But let me be clear here. This is really important. Paragraph 4 is not a license to create your own solutions when you don't like what is written in the document. When we get into the solutions, or when you see the solutions, you'll see that they cover 90% or more of the situations that you come across in a Friday night Magic event. You can and should use the solutions that is provided in the document. You definitely shouldn't be instituting your own solutions for situations that are already defined and outlined here. If the instructions say shuffle the card in the library, do that, please. Paragraph also talks about the possibility of a game loss as a penalty. And this is in the case of repeated offenses. Let's say drawing extra cards on multiple occasions at the same event. This isn't as simple as this isn't a simple, it happens one time, then a second time, then we're issuing game losses. Somewhere in there, we need to advise players, and not after the first or even in most cases the second time, hey, keep doing this, and the rules recommend that game loss be issued. Really do need to say that. And Isaac is typing, so I'm going to finish this paragraph. I'm going to wait for him to finish. This isn't something you get to carry from event to event either. And I want to make sure I'm not missing an important point. Technically, the JAR doesn't actually allow us to give game loss. That's funny. I'm going to go back and reread that section as we're talking. If a player continues to repeat a mistake despite multiple reminders, you may warn them that the next occurrence will result in a game loss. Hopefully this final step will not be required, but knowing it is possible should get players to correct their behavior. The way that's phrased, it looks like they can, Isaac. Okay. We'll move on. We can hash that one out later. Oh, okay. All right. By the way, I've never had cause to issue a game loss for this reason, but I get right. And Isaac is bringing this up right now. Exactly what I was about to say. I get the dad card. I am 47 years old. I am 6'1". I weigh a little over 200 pounds. When I tell players to stop messing around, they'll poo-poo me sometimes. When I tell them the second time and we have a conversation about what's happening and we, try and educate them a little bit more, I never see a third instance. But I get to get away with that. I think that it does happen. I was listening to a Judge Cast episode, a really old one with Jess Dunks on it, where he said that he had done this in the past. So it does happen, but it's even rarer than disqualifications. So let's talk about a scenario for a minute. Player Adam calls you to their table. The game is in turn 7. There have been multiple combats and life total changes. Someone bumped their table, and the dice used to track life totals for both players rolled. Adam says their total is at 14 and that Nan's total is at 6. Nan swears Adam's total is lower and that there is no way hers was at 6. What tools from the jar can we use here? And I'm going to give this a minute, let you ponder it. Again, I invited you to pull up the entire jar document at the beginning of this. It is there for you to use. I'm not seeing any typing. Is that good or is that bad? You can say that you don't know. That's fine. Give it another minute or two. We've got time. All correct answers. So I'll give this another minute. We'll see what other ideas pop to the front, and then we're going to talk a little bit. Oh, you've got one of those fist-sized ones, Isaac? So I'm going to let people keep typing, but for the moment, I just want to keep going with this. Right. And Jamie, you're right about that. There is no technical answer here. The jar isn't going to help us with an investigation, and it's not going to give us an answer about what to do when players lose track of life totals. For the record, neither really does the IPG or the MTR very well either. It's important to understand that the philosophy of the jar isn't perfect. No rule system that we currently has at our disposal is. That's okay. In this case, paragraph 3 helps us a little bit. It says, and I quote, "We can't prevent players from making mistakes," and, quote, "Our solution should focus on educating players." No, it's not telling us how to fix this exact situation, but it's only a 2-page document. The jar is the beginning of a judge's journey and a touchstone for others. You'll gain experience over time to help you with questions like this. And I'm just going to go back through and reread. And Isaac has the right of it, and I think it was also mentioned in part by Kevin up top. For an investigation like this, what you want to do is you want to ask him what happened last combat. and then you want to work backwards from there. You don't want to work forwards from turn 1. You want to work backwards from, if it's turn 7, you want to work backwards from turn 7. Try and get an idea for what's going on. If it takes you too long, make your best guess. Tell them that that's what it's going to be, and then move on from there. If somebody's particularly incensed about that particular line of thinking, tell them that they can talk to you later and that they should be, taking their life totals on paper, and that will prevent situations like this from happening in the future. Okay? So, after we talk about the general philosophy, we get into common issues. And the philosophy that goes into common issues is basically, let's find the quickest path to a fix so we can get players turning cards sideways again. But I'm not sure I like the way that this list is put in order. So let's reorder it for our discussion. This list works well in a way that is written for judges responding to calls, but let's talk about it in terms of complexity and what we need to know. Oops. There we go. First, card errors. All the flavors of them. Let's make them number 1. Let's make missed triggers number 2. And let's make all in-game errors, whatever the IPG affectionately refers to as game rule violations, as 3. I've reordered this within the framework of the discussion exclusively to help you should you approach these common issues. Card errors are relatively straightforward in terms of the jar. They have a very low complexity. Something measurable happened with a clear path to fixing it. Andrea has lightning bolts in her deck she's using for a standard tournament. This is what you do. Mixed triggers are a little bit more complex and tremendously common. They are first mentioned in paragraph 3 of the philosophy. And I quote, for example, whether you step in when you see a player miss a trigger should be determined by the tone you want to strike for your event. End quote. You don't have this latitude at competitive. It just doesn't exist there. I do recommend that you read up on triggers in the IPG when you can to see how it compares here. But this discussion isn't about that. I wonder, does anyone have an idea of what type of event is best for us to simply stop a game when a trigger is missed to fix it? You're watching a game of Magic, the player misses a trigger right in front of you, it's not a detrimental trigger, and you sit there and you pause that game. What type of event? Yep, kitchen table is fine. But you can even do this at regular. Yep. Pre-releases are great for this. Okay? The cards are brand new to players. This is their first time playing them. Some of them haven't even seen the cards yet. Player misses a trigger that's obvious and on the board. May not be obvious to them. It may be the first time they've touched these cards. It's okay in regular at a pre-release to stop that match and to say, hey, players, you missed that trigger. Let's take care of that. Yep. And then Isaac is still typing. We'll come back to Isaac's thought if we need to. For reference, Isaac is a really great rules guru, if you don't know. Yep. If you need help with understanding rules, I've actually asked Isaac for help in the past. He knows his stuff. All right. So lastly, we have in-game errors. And these can be decidedly more complex. I don't want to overwhelm anyone today with too many weird scenarios. What happens if player A does X while player Y has card Z on the stack? I do want to point out that the best way to learn how to fix these errors is through study and practice. Backups are a tool you can use here, but please don't back up if too much information has been revealed or too much time has passed. If you'd like a bronze rule, and by bronze rule I mean this isn't a golden rule, this isn't set in stone, this isn't something you should do all the time. But I'd like to suggest that you don't back up to fix a game state if more than a full turn has progressed or if more than 2 cards have changed hidden zones as a result of decisions made by players. That seems a little loose, and it's supposed to be. But it gives you a really good baseline to start as to where you need to be going forward. It's not hard and fast. If it were, it would be in the jar. Rather, it's just something that expresses how hard it is to fix game states when too much information has been discovered between the mistake happening and the mistake being caught. So after common issues, the jar gets into general unwanted behaviors. Of the 5 general unwanted behaviors, 4 should be familiar to everyone as unwanted behaviors. If you haven't looked at the jar in over a year, you may not realize, though, that determining match outcomes by incentives, coercion, other methods, was moved from serious problems to here. So these 4, the top 4 have always been general unwanted behaviors. The 5th one is new. It used to be under serious issues. There's a reason for that. It never felt natural or positive for the game if we had to DQ a new young player for rolling a die for an outcome. It was the definition of feel bad. And while judges shouldn't necessarily worry too much about that, at the same time, it was always a bad situation. Remember that first sentence of the jar? We're here to facilitate fun and educational experiences at a social event. DQing someone should be a method of last resort, as outlined by serious behaviors, or because someone intentionally took one of these actions when a player knew it to be a violation of the rules. Can we still DQ someone for rolling dice? Yeah, we can. But we have to have a reasonable belief that they broke the rules knowingly. In many, many previous cases before this change last year, it was reasonably clear that players did not knowingly violate that rule, hence the downshift. Now, remember earlier when I was talking about how competitive has downshifted a lot of things? This is a downshift in the jar. That little graphic there, I included it. It doesn't have anything to do with Magic, but it gets into reminding people that we need to have empathy. We need to express communication. We need to be an expert in the rules to help people understand what's going on. So let's talk about another scenario. Judge Meg, and this is an inside joke. I think Isaac will get it at least. No, not that one, the other one. Performs an announcement at the start of the final round of Swiss at a regular tournament. The announcement goes like this. Players, please remember that determining match results by incentive, coercion, or outside the game methods like rolling a dice will result in a disc. So what happens if Table 4 rolls a dice moments later to determine a winner? What is this considered at this point? Why? And I know that's not what Meg sounds like. You tell him I said that. What happens here? Do we go and do we cancel the players? Do we issue a DQ? Anybody want to take a crack at it? It's at the start of the final round of Swiss. So let's say that there's 4 rounds of Swiss. This is right before the start of the 4th round. Oh, Jamie's on a heater. Jamie has it. Okay. Did you guys hear that announcement just now? That's really where you need to start. It doesn't look great for either player at Table 4. Okay, but we do need to investigate. And by investigate, and we use investigate, it's not necessarily a bad word. Investigate means we need to ask questions. Did either of you hear the announcement? Did you hear the whole announcement? Have these players played competitive Magic before? Because if they did, they probably kind of should know this. How experienced a player are they? There's question after question after question you can ask. Jamie hits it with the first question right on the head, though. That's really where you need to start. You don't need to take long to assess if one or both players made a general unwanted behavior in this case or something more serious. The lesson here is don't be afraid to make announcements, but also understand that humans are imperfect, and it's possible that they did not hear you. Based upon what you figure out depends on how you should treat this situation. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about these serious problems. The first sentence in this part of the jar is very telling. And I'm going to quote here. Certain actions will not be tolerated under any circumstances. End quote. These actions are not spelled out beyond what is here. But if you need examples for comparison, and this is the only time I'm going to suggest you do this, this is the one time I'd suggest you actually read parts of the IPG. Look up unsporting conduct for aggressive behavior. Look up for cheating. Look up for theft if you want concrete, solid examples of what we consider to be these situations. Lying is spelled out here separately, but if you were to tie it to something, it would likely be done in reference to an action about cheating or theft. Okay? If a player lies to you, that's a DQ. Players who perform, and they have to be doing it intentionally, okay? Players who perform one of these actions or more, if they're really brazen, are to be disqualified. That's the tweet right there, okay? This isn't an optional take. There isn't a counseling session and then a finger wagging, don't do this again. The jar needs you to perform the DQ. If there were some mitigating factors, let the investigations team, and that's the group of judges and WotC staff at some high level on a mountain somewhere that takes all the documents you send to them, that's the group that reviews this. Let the investigations team determine if it's significant enough for you to warrant a change in the potential punishment. And I hate using the word punishment here, but let's face it, we're talking about players being banned from the game for a period of time as a potential outcome. From a philosophical standpoint, there doesn't look like much is here, but that's not exactly correct. There's some other things that you need to take into consideration. You need to take into consideration that the TO, that's the tournament organizer, the person running the event. So if you're working in a store, it's a store owner or a manager. TO has the ability at any time to ban a player from the premises or take other legal actions. If a player gets into a fight, law enforcement should be called, etc. And this isn't about defund the police or anything like that. You need to pull in somebody that has experience dealing with players trading blows. If you have what you feel sufficient cause to DQ the player, then the TO can't actually overrule that. The reason you should tell the TO, though, is to allow them the opportunity to determine if they wish to take further action. And I want to be careful here. It's not your place to outright recommend a particular action as the judge. But if a player was caught cheating or being threatening to another player and the TO asks you, what should I do? And it does happen with inexperienced TOs. What course of action do you have in front of you? What do you think you can say to the TO? Sure. Right? Let's go back to our documents. JAR suggests XYZ. Players can be banned from the premises, or they can be escorted out and told, you're done here for today. Don't come back until tomorrow. Whatever the choice is of the TO. If you're DQing somebody and like it's a really bad situation that you have to actually DQ them for whatever reason it is, maybe the TO wants to take that into account. Maybe the TO wants to give the person a refund. I don't know all the different permutations that can happen here, but there are permutations, and the TO needs to be kept in the loop. All right, we've got a couple more slides to go. We've got a few more minutes. We're going to try and get through them. And this is an important one. So let me read it. Player Nancy turns in a match slip for their game. The slip shows they had 2 wins. On it, their opponent, player Adam, appears to have a 1 next to their name. But on closer inspection, it could be a check mark. It's really not clear. A few minutes later, player Adam comes up to the desk and is very excited. They've never won a match in a store before. You're the scorekeeper judge. What do you do? Jamie, that's a great thought. And Kevin, you're right. Let's separate these players and let's start talking. Let's find out what's happening here. Well, somebody else was typing there. Kai, did you have something? Yeah. I'm going to let Kai finish their thought. Fair enough. So this is going to turn into a broader investigation, but the long and short of it, here's what happened. Adam did not know how to fill out a results slip, which is terribly common. This is this happens all the time, especially at pre-releases. And it can happen on the floor of a larger event because sometimes there are stores that won't use result slips, and players' first experience with result slips are on the floor of an event at a GP or someplace. Ultimately, Adam did place a check mark next to their name and left the rest of the slip empty, a very vertical check mark. Nancy volunteered to take that slip up. Nancy paused on her walk to the counter and filled out the remaining information, giving themselves the win. This investigation should result in a DQ for cheating, but circumstances like this are rare. And yeah, we have the new reporting app. Yeah, we'll see how that works long term. I have heard mixed experiences with the app itself. It's definitely still in beta. There are problems with it. I don't know if there are problems like this, but there are problems with it. There are 2 steps here that could have mitigated this. One is education about how to fill up match slips. And the other is a reminder to players that the winner is the one who should be taking slips up to the desk. Either of those would have prevented this from happening. So, try and educate players at all times, right? I'm going to hit 2 more slides real quick, and then we're going to wrap up and get out of here. And I bring this up because the jar does not go into it in any level of detail, but it's important. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about it, but there are a couple things about the DQ process that are important for you to know. Yes, it's very easy to mistakenly report. During the DQ process, taking notes is critical. DQs can be emotional. It can be emotional for the players, but it can also be emotional for judges. If you have clear notes written sequentially and with actual statements made by players, you are already ahead of the curve. You will rarely enter an investigation thinking this player is getting DQ'd. But when you turn that point and are pretty sure that is what may be happening, feel free to take a few notes as you talk to the player. Ask questions. Then, even when you think you have the whole situation in your head, ask if that's how it happened and walk through it. When you determine you'll be issuing a DQ, talk to the player through the process. Read them and supply them with the DQ paperwork available from Wizards. Give them an opportunity to write down what happened. Super important. They don't have to, but you need to give them the chance to do so. And then the last thing, and it's the thing that we often miss, especially the first one or even 2 times you do DQs, you have to write a written statement. But you need to write your written statement before you read the players' or spectators' written statements. Okay? Super critical. It has to be from your point of view without their point of view the first time you write it. Isaac is typing. I'm going to come back to whatever Isaac's saying in a minute. Knowing the philosophy of the jar is only so much. You still need to be able to level up. And this is a short list that can help you get there. Oh, yeah. Isaac's absolutely right. Make sure you get the email address. It's also so that you can get in touch with the player if you need to, if you can't read something. So leveling up is very important. Know the rules first. Read the jar. And again, and again, and again. I don't work really big events without reading through the jar at least one time before working it. And I've read the jar, I can't tell you, 10, 15, 20 times maybe by now. You can substitute classes, taking additional Judge Academy classes, with well-written articles. Listen to some podcasts. There's a podcast out there called JudgeCast, which is amazing. Lastly, whatever you do, if you're new to the program, find a judge you respect to mentor you. Ask them to help you become better. Ask them to challenge you. Knowing the rules and philosophy behind them is great. Growing as a judge is even better. And I want to close out by thanking everybody who is here today. And I especially want to thank Isaac for inviting me to present on this topic. I think he knew that it was something that was near and dear to my heart. And I want to thank Toby Elliott. If you ever get a chance to Toby Elliott, thank him for all the work that he does, because Toby does an amazing amount of work behind the scenes. And one of the things that he does currently is he is the current keeper of the jar. And the jar is just the best document. Oh, personal story. We like those. Last 2 times I've had to DQ players, I just scanned their written responses in mine and emailed them to the DCI. That way they got to decipher the players' hieroglyphics. That's amazing. I love that as a method of doing that. I'm actually really good at deciphering. I spend part of my day deciphering people's handwriting, so I have not had this problem yet, but I can understand where you're coming from, and that's a great solution. We're actually right at an hour, which is why I promised I'd be. I will stick around and chat for at least a few minutes. If you have anything you want to tell me, if you have any questions about the presentation, if you have any feedback, or if you want, there's that feedback form, which Isaac is going to throw up on the screen so that people know where to go. Ding! That's it. Please make sure you fill that out, and I'll get a copy of the feedback, and I'll be able to improve this presentation for future events.